How do you say your last name, Mandy?
Richie?
Richie. Reverend Richie. All right, we are live on YouTube talking about copyright. This is the third conversation in a series of conversations that we're going to have about copyright from various perspectives. So the first one that we had was from the artist's perspective. I had some text writers, some tune writers on, and we just chatted about what has it been like for them to navigate the world of copyright as someone who writes the song of the church. And then the conversation, I think last week, was from the perspective of local church folk. There was a priest, an Episcopal priest, a layperson who had decades of experience in various administrative capacities for both like conferences, but also local churches helping to run their copyright stuff, and then a church musician. Today is the second round of kind of that local church perspective. We have Random Richie, right? Right? What? I just asked you.
Reverend Richie.
Richie. Reverend
Yes.
Richie, who is a pastor in Austin, Texas, who I have not met until this Zoom meeting. We've just been corresponding over email. There was someone in the last conversation that two people that I had never met. And that's one of the things I love about this is I get to meet new people and hear just totally fresh perspectives, which is wonderful. So thank you for reaching out to me. And then we have, you're a reverend, aren't you, Jackson?
Yeah.
Jackson Henry, who's a Methodist deacon, formerly with Discipleship Ministries, which is kind of the larger organization for the United Methodist Church. But as I said earlier, now he's back into the real world of being a local church musician and is serving a church right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And then we have Dr. Marcel Sternagle. Did I get that right? Dang it!
Just get creative with it, and
I've been trying to get it right for you. I say it one more time.
Sternagle.
Sternagle.
There you go.
Man, I will get it right next time. I promise.
Brian, I'll answer to whatever, you know.
All right, so Dr. Marcel, who is at SMU Perkins School of Theology and runs the MSM department, he had lots of local church experience in Brazil, where he is born and raised and from, and then now has been serving in the U.S. I think a few churches in the U.S. and now trains through the MSM program people who are going to go out and be local church musicians, and also works with a lot of soon-to-be pastors since he's in that seminary setting. So why don't you just go around and fill in the gaps, because I'm the worst at introductions. I like to keep it nice and informal, but what that means is people might not have a full understanding of who you are. So, Reverend Mandy, if you want to go first, and then Jackson and Marcel, just tell us a little bit about your context, your ministry context, and maybe a little bit on how you intersect or interact with the world of copyright.
Well, I serve a small Presbyterian church in Austin, in an urban area.
PCUSA, right?
Yeah, PCUSA. And so, yeah, I've been there almost 5 years, and I am the one that primarily puts together our weekly print bulletin. Because it's a small church, I serve as pastor and administrator together, which is great fun. So one of the things that one of my staff members mentioned was, hey, Mandy, you can't put words in the bulletin without putting the copyright stuff. And I was like, yes, you can. You just put them in there. And she said, oh, no. We have a copyright license and you have to put it in there. And so it was this big question about, okay, what do you put in? What gets cited? What's covered under your copyright license? And how many times do you need to put that in the bulletin? Each and every time you put a word from our hymnal, each and every time you put, a quote from someone. And so that's been my experience, especially in the last year.
Mm-hmm.
With COVID, I've been doing a lot more print materials and emailing it and mailing it to my congregation. And I want to make sure that each artist, each writer is getting their due, getting cited, so that their work is not being, taken advantage of.
Right.
And if it's not my idea, I want to say it's this person's idea, And so navigating how to do that and what exactly to put in the bulletin is tough, because there's really no like template that says this is how you do it.
This is how you do it.
Right. And so it's been a challenge for me. How big a font do you use? I usually make it really tiny so that like it's there, but it doesn't like say, it's real, so.
But how small is too small? It's
right.
like, if I do it in 1-point font, is that illegal?
No, I usually do like a 12-point font and I make it an 8-point. So like people can see this is from somewhere. And they can acknowledge, and then how often do we put our CCLI license in there? And like, does it cover the video that I used? Because I was like, it's from this website. And so there's really no like overarching guideline from the denomination or the presbytery, or it's left to each individual church to either get a license or not.
Right.
Some presbyteries get a blanket license.
Right.
And so it's just very, very confusing. And I have a hunch that loads of stuff goes out without being properly cited.
Oh yeah.
And that's just bad. So
I want to let Jackson and Marcel introduce themselves, but I also don't want to forget a question that I want to ask you. So I'm just going to put the bug in your ear so you can think about it, so that we can circle back to it. One of my questions for you is, as a solo pastor who's doing almost all of this work because that's the ministry situation you're in, about how many hours a week would you say you are spending navigating copyright? That's what I maybe think that through. But don't, if it's too painful to think about, just don't. but let's hear from Jackson now. So Jackson, tell us a little bit about where you're coming from.
Sure. So I currently serve as the director of music ministries at Franklin First United Methodist Church. Franklin is a suburb about 20 miles outside of Nashville, south of Nashville, and is also the center of a lot of recording and a lot of the contemporary Christian music industry with Nashville and Franklin. Mm-hmm. Our church is a historic church founded in 1799, but is also a large membership church. It is a suburban church. The congregation tends to sway more on the older side, but we do have 2 campuses. We're a multi-site church. The historic sanctuary in downtown Franklin, and then we have where I am here on the main campus, which is kind of on the bypass around town. We have 3 services here, one downtown. The service downtown is a traditional word and table service. So it's a weekly sacramental service with Holy Communion and the Eucharist. Here at the main campus, we have 2 modern services and 1 traditional service. Now, the interesting part about my job is that I oversee all of that in relation to the music. So even though I'm not present at the historic sanctuary, I'm planning for what they're doing on Sundays, musically speaking, but I'm here at the main campus every Sunday, and I'm doing all the traditional elements or overseeing parts of that, and then the modern elements too. So I'm the band leader, I'm the worship leader, but I'm also the choir director and oversee children's and instrumental programming, all that kind of stuff too. So they definitely keep me busy, but in relation to copyright, I must say that I'm a little bit spoiled. One is because I do come at this from the angle of having worked at Discipleship Ministries, and for a long time was really the point person to ask about copyright things. So I've had a lot of time to think it through and have had experience in that in the local church, but I'm also a little bit spoiled because we also have a communications department here at the church, and we have a technical director and a full-time sound engineer. So I've got some folks who are really working on that end of things as it relates to COVID. And I know we'll get there in this discussion, but we have developed much more of an online presence than we had before COVID, even though we were already online and streaming and all of those things before. It's become a lot more involved during this time. So I'll be happy to speak a little bit more to it as we go on. I'm also a graduate of SMU Perkins School of Theology. So thank you, Mark.
Mandy, did you go to, just out of curiosity, did you go to Austin Presbyterian Theological?
I did not.
Oh.
I'm currently pursuing a Doctor of Ministry at Austin Seminary. My alma mater is Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh.
Oh, nice. I've got some friends up at the Pittsburgh. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so Marcel, tell us a little bit about where you're coming from.
Brian, thanks for having us, and for what I think is one of the main unresolved issues. I think I'm coming at it from several different perspectives at once. So I'm a composer, and I've had my music published here and in Brazil, either in hymnals or in recorded form, or some mishmash. So that's number one. I'm thinking as a composer. Number two, I'm thinking of it as someone who deals with chapel and worship, and consults with different musicians in different churches when they have questions and that kind of thing. So jumping through those hoops that have become increasingly more complicated. And the third is as a scholar, right? Not only as a teacher, but also as someone who thinks particularly about the issue of cultural justice and copyright. The use of global song, things like that, and it just gets more and more complicated. So I think I'm a little bit of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in this sense, because there's a part of me, even as a composer, that thinks hey, if I write a piece of music and you're using my music, then I should at least know about it, and if you're making money, I should be making money. But then there's another part of me as a composer who's grown up in an environment where that just doesn't matter. So I don't care about I don't care in the same way. In Brazil, you don't assume, even though there's a really good intellectual property law, there are a lot of informal agreements that regulate the way that people use each other's music. So even when I was in ministry, I did not worry about it unless it was particular cases. Whereas here, every conversation starts with a contract. So I shifted to the other end of the conversation. Half of me is like, okay, we got to do the proper thing, and I'll just, full disclosure and say, half of me is like, the system is broken, we should all just do whatever we want. And I'm constantly wavering between those two things.
All right, so Jackson, we could probably just dismiss you since you're, spoiled. I was thinking, you're done.
Good knowing you guys. Good talking with you.
So, well, but you may be able to speak to this as well, Jackson. You've worked a lot with local church musicians and pastors when you were at Discipleship, and you may have a sense of how much your communications team deals with this at your current church. But I'll start back with you, Mandy. So, how much time a week do you think you spend on this particular on copyright and making sure that you're doing it right, or worrying about it, or whatever?
At first it was a lot, like maybe 5-6 hours, just like, what do I put?
Mm-hmm.
What do I not put? It took me a really long time to figure out that if you put parentheses C and then parentheses, that makes the copyright symbol.
Right.
Yes. Because I was having to go into the symbols and
insert symbol. Yeah.
Yes. So, that's a fun hack you can share with the world.
There you go.
But now that I have the template that I feel, me and my staff person, who happens to be my financial secretary, but she pays the bill for the copyright license. Mm-hmm. And so she was the one that brought it to my attention. And I was like, well, what do I do? And then she just copied and pasted author, da, 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 da. And so I use that after every single piece of hymnary or lyric that I put in the bulletin.
Mm-hmm.
And we sing a lot in my church. So it's 3 or 4 different kinds of music, composer,
Sure.
hymn tune, text, composer, all that. So now it's quicker, maybe like an hour or 2.
Yeah.
But I know now where to look. We use the Glory to God hymnal and all the stuff's at the bottom, and just typing it in and making sure that the composer and the lyric writer is getting the credentials.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been an uphill, very steep learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though, and I kind of agree with Marcel, like I have 30 people in my congregation, like who's really going to care if we're singing, this song? And then the other part of me is like, well, no, we're decently in order. This is who we are as Presbyterians, like we got to make sure we have both and.
Right.
So, yeah.
So Jackson, what's your sense of how much your communications team like deals with this on a weekly basis?
Well, interestingly enough, the system I think that we have set up doesn't require, for the materials that we primarily use, a ton of work and time once the system is in place. I will tell you that some of the materials that we use, I do, like as far as the music reporting goes, I take care of that. So I take care of the bulk of a lot of our reporting, especially as it relates to the musical pieces of the service. We do have a combination of a couple of licenses, and for the most part, I will say and admit that most of the things we do fall into those 2 licenses. If there are special circumstances where we have to request permission, then we'll request permission. But for the most part, we are working within CCLI and onelicense.net. We wind up making the reporting. I do weekly reporting on those. We work through Planning Center online, so we keep up with our reports. We do that sort of a thing. But once the system is in place, provided the materials you use come from those places, it tends to be fairly simple. Is it just that all the materials that aren't covered by those things take so much longer? Probably not. Because one of the challenges is making sure that we do the ethical thing. And I will tell you that I think that it is also very tempting, rather than, oh yeah, well, we're just going to put that in there anyway, which we don't do. Most of the time we tend to err on the side of, well, we'll find something else to use. And sometimes that just has to do with workload or another option of something that speaks to something that we're looking to do. Mm-hmm. That also is not probably a just and a completely just and fair decision in the current reality of what we deal with on a weekly basis. Sometimes that's the way it goes. So
that'd be an interesting question to circle back around to the artists about. And Marcel, you are. I mean, Jackson, you have stuff published as well.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to ask that question of them, to say, and I guess everyone would have a different answer, but if a church didn't have the capacity or the understanding or whatever to get the proper license to use your piece, assuming that it's not one of the ones that's just easily done under CCLI or one license, like if it's kind of a special circumstance or if you're not published or whatever, would you rather that church just not use your piece because they want to do the ethical thing and they don't want to steal your music or whatever? Or would you rather them use your piece of music for their worship service? I would rather people use my music, personally.
Absolutely. Yeah. Every time. Well, maybe not every time, but as a matter of principle, yes.
Right.
And I know where I stand on that, Brian. Like one of the things that I find that the copyright restrictions on things cause me to do is actually write more. if I find there's something out there that would take a lot of work to use, sometimes I'm just like, well, I'll put in the time and just write something myself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It'd be easier and
And it's, and it's not even just for music, but let's say, for instance, you know the form of the collect, right? Well, you want to
Right.
write your own collect, you write your own collect, So that to
Yeah,
me tends to force a lot of creativity, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, Jackson, I wholeheartedly endorse that. I said the Jekyll and Hyde thing, but at SMU, we're really careful because we have to be, right? But being really careful and caring are not necessarily the same thing. You can be really careful for a number of reasons. You can be worried about litigation, things like that. Caring, I think, is an intentional direction or intentional journey or pilgrimage towards something, right? And I do think that there are, systemic fundamental problems with the copyright system as it is, not only for music. When you say copyright in relation to worship, for me, that intersection includes the collects, the readings, any intellectual property that goes into that artifact, if you will. So then the question for me, and I just wrote a big article on that may or may not come out depending on reviewers, but reading music industry scholarship, legal scholarship, both American and otherwise, church music scholarship, and kind of comparing the discourses around copyright to identify some of the systemic problems. And there's so much to do. I do think that part of the solution, at least, is to do what Jackson is saying. If it's a lot of work if the use of a particular piece of the liturgy is so restricted, write something else. I think that's it speaks towards the goodness of God, the goodness of creation, and here I'm going all Lutheran, right? But and the role of creativity within that framework, which I think is an important commitment.
I mean, that's also, I think, a wonderful call to the broader church to say it's okay to be creative, and in fact, sometimes it can be advantageous to just do it yourself. It may not be as awesome as that like published thing, or it may not be recorded as smoothly as this, but it's your congregation's. And so in that way, you've avoided being unethical by not getting the right licenses. You saved possibly some time by not having to worry about it. But ultimately, it spurred you into this creative process, which could then blossom into a lot more things, like a whole committee that designs a liturgy for your church that becomes a special part of that church's identity. Mandy, what do you think about that as a solo pastor who's dealing exclusively with volunteers?
There's no volunteers. It's just me.
Well, if anyone was to do anything, it would be on a volunteer basis, which is a large portion of the church. I mean,
Sure. The folks pre-COVID would read the scriptures for me. But as far as putting together the liturgy, that's up to me. And as much as I would love to write liturgy, like those feasting on the word worship companions are there for a reason. And they're lectionary based, which is what my church uses, and it all fits together. And another interesting part about me is that I'm only half time. So most of my time is spent crafting a sermon. And then, I hate to admit it, but like liturgy, there it is. Let's use some of these words. Let's make sure we say that, okay, those are feasting on the words that are not my words, because frankly, I just don't have time to write them. And if I do adapt stuff, I'll put in there, feasting on the word adapted by me, so that the authors of the feasting on the word stuff, that's why they write it, for pastors to use. But I haven't written my own liturgy like in a long time. And it's just not a luxury I have, I guess. So I'm grateful for those folks that put their stuff out there for me to use.
right.
Blessed be feasting on the word, the worship companions.
Yeah.
They're so good, and they're sound theology. And so you don't
Yeah.
have to worry about wonkiness. So,
Well, I think that's one of the services of these larger denominational entities. And, when they provide these liturgies and stuff, it's not, I mean, it can, of course it can be used for these big churches, or like in Jackson's situation, I'm sure you use that, things that are, but for the solo pastor, these are huge time savers. When you just said you're half time, so if you're spending 1 to 2 hours a week out of 20, that's a huge percentage of your time that's not spent in sermon prep, in pastoral care, in taking care of the church property, or being present. I mean, there's all the other things, all the things.
Right.
Man, that strikes me as a
Yeah.
huge percentage.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't have to worry about copyright stuff, if I was like a big jerk and didn't want to be ethical, like it would be so much easier for me to put my worship together. But I'm not a big jerk. And I want to credit where credit is due. I mean,
Right.
and we have started putting stuff on our little tiny dinky little website. But if someone's going to click on that file, they need to know where the source is. And I can't just put something on there and say that it's mine when it's not. I just can't. So yeah, there's a lot of things that solo pastors do, and there's really no such thing as a halftime pastor, just really halftime pay.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I do it because I love them and I'm called to them. So
I know this was one of the things when I was at Discipleship, and I think the folks who there would say the same thing now. Our primary means for existence at Discipleship Ministries, which is umcdiscipleship.org, by the way. I have to give them sort of that reference. Our primary purpose was creating materials for people in local churches for their use. And in most cases, I found myself in conversation with pastors who were preparing for Sunday, for instance, but were on a lunch break from their work at the post office, that kind of a thing. So it was very much in that realm of things. And the materials I know that we created were free for use by including the citation only. And so I don't know to what extent other denominational resourcing entities are working in that same vein, but at Discipleship, everything was, it was apportionment funded. So churches who support the organization through their offerings, that the materials that are created were created with that specifically in mind, so that you could use as long as you cite. And so it was free. It was not something that you had to worry about requesting extra permission, for instance, for. It was done for that purpose.
Well, let me ask you this, and Mandy, maybe this has come up in your situations, and Marcel, I'm sure you have thoughts on this. So what about what you were just describing, Jackson? Sounds pretty much like Creative Commons copyright. And for those of you who are listening out there who've never heard of Creative Commons, or who have heard of it but don't know what it is, a normal copyright is kind of set in such a way that when a text or a tune or whatever is copyrighted, you can't change it without permission. So if the text says, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty," which is public domain, by the way, but if it were still copyrighted, then you could not change it to "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God the Greatest" without permission, because you changed the text and it was copyrighted. But Creative Commons copyright, what that means is, as long as you cite the original source, you can create whatever you want out of it. So if you want to change the words, you can. If you wanted, and so you can manipulate that thing to fit your purposes, as long as you're not then profiting off of it. And there are certain limitations, but it's pretty much fair game.
Well, I would say that ours was not quite that.
Okay.
Because it was all written in some sense to try and be general enough to be able to relate, because I know at least one of the statements in our copyright clause was that it couldn't be altered, edited, or placed on a website.
Ah, I see. Right.
So it wasn't quite the same
Mm-hmm.
as a Creative Commons that way, but
It was like, so it's still copyrighted, but it was just like free to use. So copyright free to use for worship or whatever.
yes.
And even Creative Commons has a spectrum of possibilities.
Right. You can kind of label it with what's allowed to be changed, right?
Yeah. Some people use the expression copyright and copyleft, which I don't think is useful because enough of that spectrum, right? But thinking of copyright as a range of possibilities instead of like a streamlined one size fits all thing, I think is useful in that regard.
So have any of you been in a situation where you've wanted to change a song lyric or something, but then you haven't felt like you've been able to, and then you've had to choose, do I use it as is or do I just not use it? Jackson has, yeah.
Well, or either you don't use it or you include the words and you just sing something different.
Yeah, there's that. Right.
there's
I mean,
no-
in the newer versions of the hymns where they make more language inclusive and they take out
Uh-huh.
the more masculine language and put in God instead of him and all that stuff. Like I have hymnals that like the words are crossed out, and I don't know if they have permission to do that, but it's there. So
Well, just for anyone out there that's watching, if it's public domain, you can go for it. But if it's copyrighted, then that's where the question comes into play. And I think that's an interesting question. And I think once again, artists would have very different opinions on whether or not people should do that with their music.
And there might be reasons to do it either way. I'll give an example, right? You're singing something from the global south that someone in the United States copyrighted, put it in a hymnal. It's a song from a community. It has a communal origin, and within that oral framework, it is meant as a matrix for improvisation. You are literally supposed to vary. You're not supposed to sing what's on the page because that's not the spirit of the song. And I mean, to be honest, just because someone wrote it down on a piece of paper and copyrighted it in the United States, I'm not going to not improvise, even if it's not in the public domain. Because as a matter of ethics, that doesn't make sense.
So what about a song? I've been in this situation where I'm singing a song that I know was of community origin, was copyrighted here in the United States by someone who translated it or something. And I feel very conflicted about it because on the one hand, I know that the money is not going back to that community, but it is going to the publishing company and then some of it to the translator. So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, the person who like curated this or took it or whatever they did with it and then did the work of translating, they should be compensated. But on the other hand, should they get compensated when the community is not being compensated? And so sometimes I've felt really bad about reporting those types of songs.
Yeah.
Because I think that I'm actually making a bad decision. So it's kind of a catch-22 on some of these songs. And I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to Melissa Glenius more on this. She did a lot of work on this kind of subject. I think it's very problematic.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely another one of these sessions, right? We don't want to hijack this one for that purpose, but
That's
it is,
true.
and when I say these things, I'm not speaking for the university. I'm speaking for myself as a worship leader. I'm
Right.
speaking to one of those systemic problems. I think there are others. For example, Mandy, the fact that you have to spend so much time jumping through hoops to get things done, and the way that it gets in the way of the work that you need to do. For me, that's also like an ethical / theological issue that could be dealt with. And then these kind of start to compile one on top of the other. Another example, Jackson, that I think about is, we have the same combo here, CCLI plus one license. And you're right. It's a weekday. I want to get this done because I have whatever meeting is coming up next on Zoom. I'm not going to jump the fence, right? I'm going to use what's ever within that realm of possibility. But then we're also called to design creative worship, or excellent, whatever combination of words you put there, and they kind of run one against the other. So unless you have a full-time specialist, and I'm grateful that you do have someone that'll do that for you, because that must give you a kind of freedom that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Well, when I say this, by the way, like as it relates to music, I mean, I'm pretty much the guy. So I do a lot of the work in that regard. Where it's helpful for me with them is they deal a lot with all of the technology that puts us online, and oversee sort of some of the administrative elements financially for the licenses and stuff. But when it comes to the details, that goes right here, except for the pastor, if our pastor is putting in things that have that. But it's one of those things where there are also times where somebody will say, hey, this would be a really great song to include on this particular Sunday, and sometimes the streaming license gets in the way. Okay, so let's think about so an example here where we've had it before we were online and then after we were online. Okay. We had a Sunday where it was the passage, I don't remember, it was from the Gospels of, look, why do you worry? Look at the lilies in the field, how God has clothed, And so, being the appreciator of really great music, our band that Sunday sang Three Little Birds, because why not? It's Bob Marley. Works out great. Don't worry about a thing. Whatever. We did it. But we did that before we were online.
True Confessions with Jackson Henry.
And people, it really moved people. I'm not going to say people really liked it. I hate that. But it really moved people that day. And we did that before we were online. Well, you can't do that online. No, with the and we didn't display the words or anything like that. The band just got up, they did it, and under my interpretation is that falls under the religious service exemption for some of that with copyright. And so we did Bob Marley in worship. It was great. Now that we're online and streaming, that would require a lot more homework to make something like that happen. And so I'm just going to not do it.
It's darn near impossible. I've been in that situation when you get into the secular world and trying to use it for religious purposes and streaming. I mean, it's a nightmare, because the system, first of all, the system's totally different. So anything about the CCLI one license church music kind of copyright world, it's like everything is, it's like they're using the same words but differently, and everything's on a much bigger scale, including the finances.
Right.
It
and
is
that's where
intimidating.
Marcel and Mandy, I'm in line with both of you. Some days I have days where I'm just like, no, I'm not going to do that, because, in order to get permission to use Three Little Birds, it's going to take me 6 months and I'm going to have to pay a lot of money. So I'm just not going to do it, And so it's on a different scale, Mandy. I know that necessarily than what you're working with through parts of the liturgy and this and that, but it's still the same. It's still the same frustration.
Yeah, I think the biggest question for me is, am I doing it right? And I think we have a CCL license, pretty sure we pay for it, I think, but I don't know what it covers. I don't know what one license is. Creative Commons, that's like the little C thing by the picture, right? I have no idea what that is.
No, that's closed caption.
No. It's Creative Commons license.
Okay.
If you're using an image on a website or something.
Okay.
Right? And so as this whole pandemic deal started to open up, suddenly I became a televangelist, and I needed to make print media. And I definitely went to seminary to learn how to do all of those things. No, I didn't at all. So suddenly we need to know a whole lot about a thing that no one really talks about. I hope I'm doing it right. I hope that, I can ask forgiveness later if I've screwed it up, and then I'll get points for like trying. And then I don't get sued by somebody, because I tried to do it and just footnoted it wrong. So it's just very difficult to figure that out.
Mandy, we designed here at, kind of in response to the pandemic, but also because we needed it to be in the curriculum for the MDivs, a class that focuses on digital ministries. And we've just come to the realization that we can't have people out the door with their diploma in hand that can't think theologically about the digital aspects of ministry, much less get together, put together a social media profile. Now, granted, we're not teaching people how to do Facebook Live, because you can watch a YouTube video that will be much better than what that's not why they're paying to be there, but helping them to establish a theology of digital ministry. So think theologically about these things in a way that undergirds their practices, and then connecting them to the practices themselves. It's one, we taught that class. I'm teaching it again in the summer, and it's just to your point that it's something that you now have to know how to do or interact with on some level. Whereas before, like Jackson said, you could go up there and sing three little birds. Worship service is over. Yeah. You're done.
Yeah. Or throw in a U2 at the end of on the postlude, like, where the streets have no name. No one would know, but everyone would love it, right? I can't do that anymore. Even though it's so cool.
Well, and one of the things that I'll say in relation, Mandy, to your comment about the specifics as it relates to the citation and just the details of that, is that if you contact the folks at CCLI and onelicense.net and any other licensing agency, I mean, those are kind of the big two, if you've got to pick two. I have always, and I said this in my work at Discipleship all the time, I have always found them to be incredibly helpful. There are some good Q&A pages on their websites, but further than they don't answer it clearly everything. But when I've picked up the phone and called someone at CCLI or called someone at onelicense.net, they are the best resource that we have in relation to those things, and they can usually clear up those things in something very quickly. And so all it takes is that phone call to make that happen, and they've been great. And they know everything. They're actually answering the phone to talk to you because they know everything about it.
And I will say, the system's definitely not perfect, and I think a lot of, like Marcel, you were talking about the kind of larger systemic problems that are going on. I mean, a lot of it goes all the way down to the law and how the law is structured in the U.S. And so, I know that CCLI and One License were created to help church musicians and pastors to try to minimize the amount of work that it takes, and it's still such a struggle, and that's all they do. That's all they're trying to do, is to connect artists to get paid for their stuff and make it easy for churches to report that and kind of streamline this. But it's so complicated and convoluted in certain ways that even with companies where that's all they're doing, it can be very intimidating. And then when you combine that with the lack of education that most of us come out of school with, when it comes down to the details of reporting copyright and even what companies are out there that do copyright, there are a lot of hurdles. But let me kind of bring us to our closing topic. So my wrap up question for everyone. So I asked the artist this, I'm asking you all this, I'm going to ask the publishers this. When I have some publishers on here, I'll ask the One License and CCLI folks this. I'll ask the copyright lawyers this, because I'm getting a group of copyright lawyers together to talk. The wrap-up question is, if you could make one change to the current system to make it more helpful to you, specifically you all as congregational leaders, what would you change? So maybe we'll start with Marcel, because I think you introduced last, and then Jackson, and then we'll end with Mandy. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Marcel.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. And sometimes I think from the scholarship perspective, my role is kind of to identify the systemic, especially from kind of like that decolonial perspective that is more critical of the cultural industry at large and globalization, which are the things that I kind of study and talk about. It becomes really difficult to think of one thing. I can tell you how I address that in relation to my own materials, right? So a lot of times, whatever I publish in Brazil, I just throw it out there. And sometimes I'll get videos of people doing my music in like weird places that I've never been to. I have no, it doesn't matter. So I operate under that assumption. And I still do, as a composer, operate under that assumption. Now, if I could connect that kind of behavior to my compositional presence in the U.S. In terms of copyright here, then that would be beneficial. I haven't been able to do that in a way that makes sense for me and makes sense for both sides. But again, that's a huge undertaking, so that's a very diluted answer to your question.
Well, I'm not so sure, because, I mean, there are algorithms that are good enough now on like YouTube. It can identify the exact song that you're playing. So if you're playing live and you're playing something copyrighted, it'll flag you in real time, right? And they're a little overzealous with that, but that's a different topic. So I mean, wouldn't it be awesome for you, Marcel, as an artist and as a church musician, if you publish a song, you go into a centralized database, you register it, you put your recording on there, it analyzes the algorithm analyzes it, and then anytime it shows up on Facebook Live, YouTube, wherever it ends up on the internet, if it's on a server in the US, then you get 0.001 cent every time it's viewed. And the way that that's paid for is that the church that posted it is just paying an annual copyright fee to the centralized database that kind of funds it back into the artists, and the algorithms do all the work. Right?
Yeah, that might be one possibility.
That way
I'm cynical towards the idea that any of that will happen without any kind of corporate interest, ad-driven system in place. But again, we go back to the ethics. Yeah, I don't know, Brian. Maybe it's because I spent the last month doing research on this, and right now I'm very cynical about the whole thing.
Research does that to you. Gotta be careful.
It does. Yeah, it ruins everything.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss. All right, so Jackson, if you could change one thing to make your life easier, or change one thing in the system to make it more helpful to you as a congregational leader, what would you change?
Lord. So here's, this is coming at this from both a user in the local church, but also a writer. You have to understand my writing comes out of a desire to provide resources for people. My preference is, I know it's a very privileged, and I acknowledge this, it's a very privileged thing to say that I'd rather not get paid for the things that I create. And I know that is a statement of privilege, because I have other means of being able to make a living. But I think of this because when people contact me about using my materials, there's a part of me that says, I really wish they didn't have to. I really wish I could share this with people in a generous spirit that allows people to not have to come and ask me for permission. Now, again, that's a statement of privilege. I get it. I understand. I know that. But on the user end, it would also be great to know that when you purchase something or when you enter into an agreement to use something, that you are given like the need to how do I say this in such a way? Like, let's say I'm going to use a piece of choral music as an example. When I buy a piece of choral music, it would be great if I could tack on an extra few dollars to cover any kind of licensing that I might need to use for that if they don't participate in another licensing, in a blanket licensing program. If there's a song that somebody has on YouTube, I have worked with this group through Discipleship, this CCLI Top 100 and Beyond vetting process. We just had a podcast about this yesterday, and it's really great having all these songs that are on that list now that aren't on CCLI's Top 100, but a lot of them require that you get added permission because they're not covered by a blanket license. And so it would be really great to be able to have access to those songs somewhere where there was some kind of clearinghouse where you could go in and get that permission and do it. Because I think that one of the big hurdles for people in the local church of not using materials is the headache. And we've discussed that here. If there's a headache that you have to go through to even get access to the materials, you're not going to do it. And people aren't going to do it as much. If we really want a lot of materials to start to arise, there's got to be something to come up as a possibility if they're not covered by a blanket license. So when you incorporate songs, when you incorporate prayers, when you incorporate written portions of the liturgy, that there's a way to do that. And I'm not a smart enough person to have that answer about how that's done. But that's the piece it seems to me like is missing for underrepresented songwriters.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be some easier way to make it happen.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting talking to folks who are trying to figure out solutions to that. Kind of like a decentralized way to make sure that the artists can get their things published in a simple way where the copyrights are covered so it's easy for churches, but then so many different solutions are popping up now it's starting to get really confusing about where you even go. So it's like by trying to fix the system, you're actually making the system more complicated because the current system's still in place. But people are thinking about it and they're working on it. And I think there are some promising models that are popping up. Always trying to end on a hopeful note. So Mandy, you are our last wrap-up question. If you could change one thing to the current system to make it more helpful to you as a congregational leader, what would you change?
I'd throw the whole thing out and just use the material and, maybe put it in my ordination vows. I promise not to steal stuff and pass it off as my own. Yes. And if everyone answered yes to that question, then intellectual property would be protected. People wouldn't take advantage of everybody else. Oh, wait, I'm talking about heaven on earth. It would just be where folks trusted me not to take advantage. And I know, we're broken people and humanity is depraved and all of that stuff. But for me not to have to worry about it and for folks to trust me to do good with their materials.
Yeah.
So that I didn't have to worry about it and make sure that, I'm telling you what hymn I'm using out of the Glory to God hymnal. Mm-hmm. It would take so much of the detail thinking away from putting my worship stuff together, and it would allow me to focus more on flow and does this prayer match and does this hymn match and right. Where's my sermon going this week and how is this going to edify and uplift my people?
Yeah.
So maybe that's cynical, maybe that's hopeful, but I would just make it easier to be able to do good.
I think I've been able to answer this question every time I have a conversation, so it's really not one thing I would change, but related to your change, Mandy, I would do what I would change is if you buy a hymnal for your congregation. So if you have a congregation of 30, you have 30 hymnals,
oh, yeah.
right? that comes along with permission to stream it on YouTube as long as it's not monetized.
Yeah. And I mean,
Like,
that's
why
great.
have a separate license?
Right. I would want permission to print the lyrics in my bulletin without having to say, this is Be Thou My Vision, the tune is Slain, it's an Irish ballad, blah, 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 you know, and it like frankly takes up space, and I'm trying to save paper. So
Yeah, I would love to have all that kind of built into the hymnal purchase.
that
Because
would be
I mean,
great.
really, what artist is making any money off of the YouTube streams of their hymn that's in Glory to God? Like,
Of
I
hymns?
don't know any.
I mean,
I don't know anybody that's
I mean, I
making money.
know the hymns are great, but I mean, a lot
So
of them are older than me.
I feel like they should just build that into the contracts when they're doing the
that would
copyright
be great.
agreements.
I would pay $3 or $4 more per hymnal just to have to not worry about it. And honestly, I would probably do that for any material, just to be able to say, I've purchased this. I promise I'm not going to sell it. It's for church, for crying out loud. I'm an honest person. Like, yeah. But that's tough. That's tough. So there's really no good solution, except I think to strive to make it better. So.
Exactly. Well, does anyone have any closing comments before we wrap this thing up and say goodbye? Marcel, I thought I saw your.
No, I don't think I have anything hopeful to say about this.
Listen, one thing that I will say is that this is, I mean, copyright has become a perfect example of how humanity has a tendency to really foul things up, because the original purpose, I always reminded people of this when I talked about copyright, the original purpose of copyright when it was first thought up and put into law was to allow creative people to be creative, because it encouraged the creation of things. And it encouraged people to be creative by being able to make a living at simply being creative, because the overall goal was that if we are creative, if some people are creative, then the whole community will be uplifted through that. We've kind of made it a marketplace, and it has become corrupted in that. And I wish that simply we could I wish there was a way to get back to the original purpose of copyright, to encouraging people to be creative, but I don't know that we can. So I'm with you, Marcel. I don't.
That sounded like it was going to be hopeful, and then it just took an awful
Then I
turn at the
dashed
end.
it against the rocks.
That was a
Maybe it's an MSM thing.
could be. Well, all right, folks, it's been an hour. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. If you've been watching on YouTube Live, or if you're watching in the future, I hope you've found some places to commiserate. I hope you found some helpful tips along the way. And please know that we are working on this, and we're not just moaning and complaining about this, but we're actively seeking out these questions, having these conversations so that we can be a part of some solutions. Or at least have conversations with people who might be able to think more creatively than I can, and then have the power to change things, so that we can all do ministry in a more ethical way, in a more streamlined way, so that we can really spread the gospel and do our thing. So thanks for being here.